The slap echoed through the diner like a gunshot. Every fork froze midair, every breath held. The waitress stumbled backward, coffee spreading across the floor like spilled blood, her cheek already swelling red. Sheriff Roy Caldwell stood over her, badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights, daring anyone to speak. No one did. But in the corner booth, a man sat motionless, calloused hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee. A 7-year-old girl pressed against his side, her small fingers gripping his sleeve. Beneath the table, a German shepherd lay coiled like a loaded spring. The sheriff didn't notice him. He should have, because that quiet stranger had spent 15 years teaching men like Roy what fear really meant. And his daughter was watching everything he would do next. Cedar Falls was the kind of town where secrets aged like whiskey in forgotten barrels, growing darker and more potent with each passing year. Population 2,000 and shrinking, it sat nestled between hills that locals called mountains and a river that ran brown with rust from the abandoned steel mill upstream. The Main Street storefronts told the story of a community learning to survive on less, their faded awnings and cracked window displays serving as monuments to better days. Folks here worked with their hands, paid their taxes, went to church on Sundays, and kept their mouths shut when certain topics came up. That was the unwritten law of Cedar Falls, more binding than anything in the county statute books. You minded your own business, you looked the other way, and you never, under any circumstances, questioned the man who wore the badge. Roy Caldwell had been sheriff for going on 18 years now, inheriting the position from his father, the way some men inherit pocket watches or hunting rifles. The Caldwells had run this county since before most residents were born, and Roy wore that legacy like armor. He stood 6'2" with a belly that strained against his khaki uniform, and eyes the color of dirty dishwater, flat and cold, and utterly devoid of anything resembling conscience. The townspeople had learned to read his moods the way sailors read the sky before a storm. When Roy Caldwell walked into an establishment, voices dropped to whispers, spines straightened, and prayers were muttered under breath. He took what he wanted, said what he pleased, and God help anyone foolish enough to suggest he do otherwise. 3 men had tried over the years. 1 moved away. 1 had an accident on a back road. The 3rd simply disappeared, his truck found empty by the reservoir, keys still in the ignition. Mel's Diner occupied the corner of Main and 4th, a chrome and vinyl relic from the 1950s that served the best chicken fried steak within 50 miles. The lunch crowd had thinned out by 2 in the afternoon, leaving only a handful of regulars scattered among the red leather booths and swivel stools. Tom Harris, the owner, stood behind the counter polishing glasses that were already clean, his weathered face carrying the permanent expression of a man who had seen too much and said too little. He was 63 years old and had run this place for 30 of those years, long enough to know that the small black dome mounted in the corner above the register contained more than just a deterrent for would-be robbers. That camera had recorded things over the years, things Tom kept backed up on hard drives hidden in his basement, insurance policies he hoped he would never need to cash. The bell above the door chimed at 2:15, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sheriff Roy Caldwell swaggered in with the confidence of a man who had never been told no in his entire miserable life. His deputy boots tracked mud across the freshly mopped floor as he made his way to his usual booth, the one by the window where he could watch the street and remind everyone in town exactly who owned this place. He didn't acknowledge the other diners, didn't nod at Tom, didn't even glance at the woman who hurried over with a menu he never bothered to open. In Roy Caldwell's world, other people existed only to serve his needs or stay out of his way. Today, unfortunately for everyone in Mel's Diner, someone would fail to do either. Jack Miller had not planned to stop in Cedar Falls. The town wasn't on any map he cared about, just another forgotten dot along the rural highway, that connected the cemetery where his wife was buried to the small house in Virginia where he was raising their daughter alone. But Rosie had needed to use the bathroom, and the diner's neon sign promised hot food and clean restrooms. So Jack had pulled his pickup into the gravel lot and led his little girl inside. That was 45 minutes ago, before the sheriff arrived, before the world tilted on its axis and forced Jack to confront questions he had spent 3 years trying to avoid. He sat in the corner booth, the one farthest from the door, with clear sight lines to every exit, old habits from a life he had tried to leave behind. Rosie was pressed against his left side, her small body radiating warmth as she worked on the coloring page the waitress had brought with her grilled cheese. Beneath the table, Atlas lay with his massive head resting on Jack's boot, 110 pounds of Belgian Malinois trained to respond to silent commands in 3 languages. To anyone watching, they were just a father and daughter, stopping for a late lunch, unremarkable in every way. But the calluses on Jack's hands told a different story, as did the quiet alertness in his gray eyes, and the way he automatically cataloged every person who entered or exited the establishment. 15 years as a Navy SEAL left marks that civilian clothes could never fully conceal. Rosie looked up from her coloring, a purple crayon clutched in her small fist. Her mother's eyes stared back at Jack from that innocent face, dark brown and full of questions that grew more complicated with each passing year. She was 7 now, old enough to understand that Mommy was gone, but still young enough to believe that Daddy could fix anything. That faith terrified Jack more than any enemy combatant ever had. He had failed so many people in his life, made decisions that haunted him in the small hours of the night. But failing Rosie was something he could not survive. Every choice he made now, every action he took, was filtered through a single question. What kind of man do I want my daughter to see when she looks at me? Daddy, why did you become a soldier? The question came out of nowhere, the way children's questions always did, dropping into conversation like stones into still water. Jack set down his coffee cup and considered his answer carefully. Rosie deserved the truth, or at least as much of it as a 7-year-old could understand. He thought about the things he had done in service of his country, the lives he had taken, and the lives he had saved, the gray moral landscape he had navigated for so many years. None of that was suitable for a child's ears. But the core of it, the reason he had enlisted in the first place, that was something he could share. Because I wanted you to grow up in a world where good people don't have to be afraid, he said finally, reaching over to brush a strand of hair from her forehead. I wanted to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Rosie nodded solemnly, processing this information with the gravity only children could muster. Then she returned to her coloring, apparently satisfied with his answer. Jack watched her for a moment, marveling at how something so small could contain his entire universe. He had killed men with his bare hands. He had jumped from aircraft into hostile territory. He had endured interrogation training that would break most people's minds. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the terrifying vulnerability of loving a child. The waitress was named Colleen Marsh, though the plastic tag pinned to her uniform simply read Colleen in faded letters. She was 34 years old, divorced, raising 2 kids on tips and minimum wage while taking night classes at the community college. Jack had noticed her earlier, the way she moved between tables with efficient grace, her smile genuine even when customers were rude. She had brought Rosie extra crayons without being asked and refilled Jack's coffee twice, each time with a comment about his well-behaved daughter. Now she approached Sheriff Caldwell's booth with a pot of fresh coffee and the kind of professional friendliness that came from years of practice dealing with difficult customers. What happened next would replay in Jack's mind for weeks afterward, each detail seared into memory with perfect clarity. Colleen reached across the table to fill the sheriff's cup. Her sleeve caught the edge of a ketchup bottle, sending it tumbling. The bottle struck the coffee pot, which jerked in her grip, and a splash of hot liquid landed on the table inches from Caldwell's hand. It was an accident, the kind that happened a dozen times a day in diners across America, usually followed by apologies and paper towels and perhaps a comped meal. But Roy Caldwell was not most customers, and Cedar Falls was not most towns. The sheriff's hand moved faster than seemed possible for a man his size. His palm connected with Colleen's cheek like a thunderclap, the impact snapping her head sideways and sending her stumbling into the adjacent booth. The coffee pot shattered on the floor, adding the smell of burning liquid to the sudden violence. Colleen caught herself on the table edge, one hand pressed to her already swelling face, her eyes wide with shock and something worse, something that looked like resignation. She had been hit before, her posture said. She knew what came next. She knew there was nothing she could do about it. "Watch what you're doing, you clumsy bitch," Caldwell's voice carried through the suddenly silent diner, each word dripping with contempt. He didn't stand, didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. His casual cruelty was somehow worse than rage would have been, the violence delivered as matter-of-factly as a man swatting a fly. "You're lucky I don't have you arrested for assault on an officer. Now clean this mess up and bring me my food. And it better be free, or I'll make sure this dump fails its next health inspection." No one moved. No one spoke. The other diners suddenly found their plates fascinating, their eyes locked downward, as if staring hard enough at their meatloaf might transport them somewhere else entirely. Tom Harris gripped the counter edge until his knuckles went white, his jaw working soundlessly. Deputy Luke Ramirez, who had entered with the sheriff but remained near the door, shifted his weight from foot to foot, like a man standing on hot coals. He was 26 years old, still new enough to the job that his conscience hadn't been fully cauterized. His hand twitched toward his phone, then dropped to his side. He knew better. Everyone in Cedar Falls knew better. Rosie's small fingers tightened on Jack's sleeve. He looked down to find his daughter staring at him with those huge brown eyes, her coloring page forgotten. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The question in her gaze was clear enough to shatter his heart. "Why isn't anyone helping her, Daddy? Why isn't anyone stopping him?" Jack felt the familiar coldness settling into his chest, the battle calm that had carried him through countless firefights and close-quarters engagements. Atlas stirred beneath the table, responding to the subtle shift in his handler's body chemistry. The dog knew violence was coming. The dog was always the first to know. But Jack didn't move. Not yet. Because Rosie was watching, and what he did in the next few minutes would teach her something about the world and her father's place in it. He could not unsee his daughter witnessing him break a man's bones, no matter how much that man deserved it. There had to be another way. There had to be a path that led through this moment without sacrificing either his principles or his daughter's innocence. Jack Miller had spent 15 years solving problems with violence. Now, with Rosie's eyes on him, he would have to find a different solution. Colleen Marsh wiped blood from her split lip with the back of her hand and bent to pick up the broken glass, her movements mechanical with practiced humiliation. Jack watched the way her shoulders hunched inward, making herself smaller, less visible, less of a target. He had seen that posture before, in villages on the other side of the world, where cruelty was just another tool of control. It looked the same everywhere, he realized. Oppression had a universal body language. The only thing that changed was the uniform of the oppressor. "Rosie, baby, I need you to do something for Daddy." Jack kept his voice low and calm, maintaining the fiction that nothing was wrong, even as every nerve in his body screamed for action. "I'm going to give you some money, and I want you to go up to the counter and pay for our lunch. Can you do that for me?" Rosie nodded, her expression uncertain but trusting. Jack pressed a $20 bill into her palm and watched her slide out of the booth, Atlas moving with her like a shadow. The dog would keep her safe. That was what Atlas did. That was what Jack had trained him to do when Jack himself could not be there. Tom Harris intercepted Rosie at the register, his weathered face softening as he looked down at the little girl with the $20 bill clutched in both hands. Jack caught the old man's eye and held it for a moment. A silent communication passing between them. Watch her. Protect her. Tom nodded almost imperceptibly and began making change with exaggerated slowness, engaging Rosie in gentle conversation about her coloring page. Good. That bought Jack a few minutes to handle this situation without his daughter in the immediate blast radius. He rose from the booth with the deliberate movements of a man who had learned to conserve energy for when it mattered. Sheriff Caldwell didn't notice him at first, too busy examining his fingernails, while Colleen crawled on the floor, picking up shards of broken glass. The other diners noticed, though. Jack could feel their eyes tracking him as he walked to where Colleen knelt, their attention sharp with desperate hope and the fear that always accompanied it. Hope was dangerous in places like Cedar Falls. Hope got people hurt. Ma'am. Jack crouched beside Colleen, keeping his voice soft and his movements non-threatening. Let me help you with that. He began gathering broken glass, ignoring the way his presence had suddenly charged the atmosphere like ozone before a lightning strike. Colleen looked up at him with startled eyes, her swelling cheek already darkening toward purple. Up close, he could see the faint traces of older bruises, yellow and green shadows lurking beneath makeup that hadn't quite done its job. This was not the first time someone had laid hands on her. He would bet his pension it was not even the first time this month. You don't want to do that, friend. The sheriff's voice sliced through the moment like a blade. That woman needs to learn her place. Wouldn't want you getting the wrong idea about how things work around here. Jack stood slowly, turning to face Roy Caldwell for the first time. The sheriff had risen from his booth, one hand resting casually on his holstered weapon in a gesture meant to intimidate. Jack had seen harder men than this one crumble under fire. He had held dying friends in his arms and kept fighting. Roy Caldwell was a schoolyard bully with a badge, nothing more. And Jack had eaten men like him for breakfast in places that made this quiet diner look like a paradise. I'm just passing through. Jack's voice was even, betraying nothing of the calculations running through his mind. Threat assessment, exits, collateral damage potential. Rosie's location, confirmed at the counter with Tom and Atlas. Thought I'd help clean up the mess. Accidents happen. The word accident hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that both men understood perfectly. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. He was not accustomed to being challenged, even in so mild a fashion. In his experience, strangers learned quickly to look away and keep walking. This one was different. This one looked at him like an equal, or worse, like something to be studied and evaluated. That's so. The sheriff stepped closer, using his bulk to crowd Jack's space. And just who the hell are you to be passing through my town, running from something? Maybe I should run your plates, see what comes up. Man traveling alone with a little girl. That raises questions, doesn't it? Questions I might need to ask downtown. The threat was clear. Cross me, and I will use my authority to make your life a living hell. Jack had heard similar threats before, usually from men with far more power and far fewer scruples than a corrupt county sheriff. None of them had succeeded in breaking him. None of them had his daughter watching from 20 feet away. I'm a father. Jack said the words simply, without aggression, letting them stand on their own merits. I'm driving my daughter home from visiting her mother's grave. We stopped for lunch because my little girl needed to use the restroom. That's all I am. That's all I'm doing here. Something flickered in Caldwell's expression, too quick to identify. Perhaps he heard the subtle warning buried in Jack's calm tone. Perhaps he recognized in Jack the presence of a predator more dangerous than himself. Or perhaps he simply could not process the experience of someone meeting his gaze without flinching. Colleen. Jack turned his attention back to the waitress, who had stopped cleaning and was watching the confrontation with naked terror. "I'd like to settle my bill, and I'd like to cover the sheriff's meal as well. Whatever he ordered, whatever he was planning to order. Put it on my tab." The words were addressed to her, but the message was for Caldwell. "I am removing the excuse you were about to use to hurt her further. I am solving this problem without giving you justification to escalate. Your move." The sheriff's face darkened with a fury that would have sent most men scurrying for the door. Jack had just publicly undermined him, had demonstrated that his intimidation was ineffective, had called his bluff in front of witnesses. In the calculus of small-town power, that was an unforgivable sin. Roy Caldwell had built his entire identity around being feared. A stranger had just shown everyone in this diner that fear was optional, that could not be allowed to stand. Tom Harris's voice cut through the tension. "That's real generous of you, sir. Colleen, why don't you ring this gentleman up? His little girl's been waiting real patient at the counter." Jack turned away from the sheriff, a deliberate show of dismissal, and walked toward the register where Rosie stood clutching her change. Atlas rose to his feet as Jack approached, the dog's intelligent eyes tracking the sheriff's position without appearing to do so. Jack ruffled Rosie's hair and smiled at her, projecting a calm he did not feel. Behind him, he could sense Caldwell making a decision, could practically hear the gears turning in that mean little mind. The sheriff could let this go, could accept the face-saving gesture of a free meal and content himself with minor harassment. Or he could escalate, could reassert dominance through the only language he truly understood. "Hold it right there." The command came sharp and loud, meant to stop Jack in his tracks and remind everyone present who held the power in this room. Jack paused, but did not turn. He felt Rosie press closer against his leg, her small hand finding his with desperate urgency. Atlas shifted into a protective stance, every muscle tensed and ready. At the counter, Tom Harris reached beneath the register, his movement hidden from the sheriff's view. Deputy Luke Ramirez stepped forward, his young face twisted with conflicting loyalties. "Turn around when I'm talking to you." Caldwell's boots struck the floor with measured steps, closing the distance between them. "Nobody disrespects me in my own town and walks away, not without consequences." Jack turned slowly, placing his body between the sheriff and Rosie. His daughter should not see what might happen next. No child should ever have to watch their parent fight, even when the fighting was necessary, even when the fighting was right. What happened next would be debated in Cedar Falls for years afterward. The sheriff drew back his hand to strike Jack the same way he had struck Colleen, expecting the stranger to cower or at least to flinch. Jack did neither. He stood perfectly still as Caldwell's palm connected with his cheek, the slap echoing through the silent diner with almost theatrical resonance. Rosie screamed, Atlas barked, and Jack Miller, who had killed men in 7 countries and could have dismantled Roy Caldwell in roughly 3 seconds, did absolutely nothing. "Rosie." Jack's voice was steady despite the red handprint blooming on his face. He did not take his eyes off the sheriff, but his words were entirely for his daughter. "Look at Daddy. I want you to see something important." He heard her frightened sobs behind him, felt her trembling against his leg where she had buried her face. A man who has to hit people to feel strong is the weakest man in the room. Real strength, baby girl, real courage. It's not about hurting people. It's about choosing not to, even when they deserve it, especially when they deserve it. Caldwell sneered, mistaking restraint for weakness the way bullies always did. "Hear that? The man's giving parenting lessons while I slap him around. What kind of father lets his kid see him take a beating without fighting back? A coward? That's what." A pathetic, spineless coward. He drew back his hand again, emboldened by Jack's apparent submission. This time, Jack caught his wrist. The movement was so fast, it seemed to skip frames. One instant, the sheriff's palm descending. The next, his arm locked in a grip that felt like steel cables wrapped in human skin. Caldwell tried to pull free and failed. His face went pale as he realized he could not move, could not even make Jack's arm tremble. For the first time in 18 years, Roy Caldwell felt genuine fear. "I'm not going to hurt you." Jack spoke softly, his words intended only for the sheriff's ears. "But I want you to understand something. I could end you right now, in ways you can't even imagine. And there's nothing you or your deputy or anyone else in this town could do to stop me. I'm choosing not to. Remember that. Remember that the next time you raise your hand to someone who can't fight back." He released the sheriff's wrist and stepped away, watching the realization dawn in Caldwell's eyes. The sheriff had spent his entire life trading on fear, wielding it like a weapon against anyone who dared question his authority. Now, for perhaps the first time, he understood what true fear felt like. Not the manufactured terror of a bully's threats, but the primal recognition of standing before something genuinely dangerous. Jack turned to scoop Rosie into his arms, feeling her small body trembling against his chest. The little girl buried her face in his neck, her tears soaking into his collar with the desperate relief of a child who had feared losing her father. Atlas fell into step beside them as Jack walked toward the door, the dog's presence a silent promise of protection that required no words. Behind them, the diner remained frozen in tableau, every person present processing what they had just witnessed. A stranger had stood up to Roy Caldwell. A stranger had shown them that the monster they feared was just a man after all. "You're under arrest." The words came out strangled, Caldwell clutching his wrist like Jack had broken it. Assault on a police officer, resisting arrest, threatening a law enforcement official. "Luke, arrest this man right now." Deputy Ramirez hesitated, his hand hovering near his handcuffs. He had seen what happened. Had witnessed his boss strike a citizen without provocation, not once, but twice. He had also seen the camera mounted in the corner, its red light blinking steadily. Tom Harris was already holding his phone, had been recording since the moment Jack stood up from his booth. The tide was turning in Cedar Falls, and Luke Ramirez could feel it. "I'll go quietly." Jack's voice was calm as he handed Rosie to Tom Harris, who gathered the frightened child against his chest with grandfatherly tenderness. "Call the state police. Call the FBI if you want. Let them see what your cameras recorded today. Let them see what kind of man wears a badge in this county." He held his wrists out to Luke, an offering and a challenge wrapped in one gesture. "While you're at it, you might want to ask around about some missing person cases. Man by the name of Jenkins who disappeared a few years back. I have a feeling the federal authorities would be very interested in his story." The name hit Caldwell like a physical blow. Carl Jenkins, the last man who had openly challenged the sheriff's authority, whose truck had been found empty by the reservoir, whose body had never been recovered. Caldwell had always believed that secret was safely buried, but the way this stranger spoke, the name suggested otherwise. How could he know? What else did he know? The sheriff's certainty crumbled like a sandcastle meeting the tide, fear replacing arrogance with dizzying speed. "Tom." Jack's eyes found the old diner owner, conveying a message that required no words. "Make sure my daughter is safe. Make sure those recordings get to the right people, every single one of them." Tom nodded, understanding perfectly. The hard drives in his basement, the years of footage showing the sheriff's countless abuses, his insurance policies were finally going to pay out. He had waited 18 years for someone to stand up to Roy Caldwell. He had begun to believe no one ever would. The next 6 hours unfolded like a dam breaking in slow motion. Luke Ramirez made a phone call that would define the rest of his career, reaching out to a contact at the State Police Academy, a former instructor who had always told him to call if he ever found himself choosing between the badge and his conscience. Federal agents arrived before sunset, their dark SUVs rolling into Cedar Falls like the cavalry in an old western. Tom Harris handed over his evidence with the relief of a man setting down a burden he had carried far too long. And in the county jail, where Roy Caldwell had thrown Jack on fabricated charges, the walls began to close in on a dynasty built on fear and silence. Jack sat on the concrete bench of his holding cell, watching the shadows lengthen through the barred window. He thought about the men he had killed over the years, enemies of his country, who would have killed him just as readily if given the chance. He thought about the moral compromises he had made in service of a greater good, the blood on his hands that no amount of scrubbing could ever fully clean. He had always justified those actions as necessary, as the price of protecting the innocent. But sitting in this small cell, waiting for justice to take its course, he realized something that had eluded him for 15 years. Sometimes protecting the innocent meant showing them that protection did not require violence. Sometimes the greatest strength was demonstrated through restraint. The concrete walls seemed to press closer as night fell, bringing with them memories Jack had spent years trying to bury. He remembered the faces of men he had watched die, some by his hand, and others despite his best efforts to save them. He remembered the weight of failure that had followed him home from his last deployment. The darkness that had nearly consumed him before Rosie's existence gave him a reason to keep breathing. His wife had seen that darkness and loved him anyway. She had believed he could be more than the sum of his worst moments. Sitting in this cell, Jack wondered if today had finally proven her right. The cell door opened 3 hours later to reveal an FBI agent with a folder full of evidence and an apology on her lips. Roy Caldwell had been arrested at his home, screaming about lawyers and connections and how everyone in this town worked for him. Those screams had died quickly when the agents mentioned Carl Jenkins and several other names that had surfaced during their rapid investigation. The sheriff of Cedar Falls was finished. His reign of terror had ended, not with a bullet or a beating, but with the truth finally being told by people who were no longer afraid to tell it. Rosie ran to Jack the moment he stepped out of the county building, her small body colliding with his legs with enough force to nearly topple him. Atlas circled them both, tail wagging frantically, reuniting his pack after a separation that had felt like an eternity to the loyal dog. Tom Harris stood nearby, looking 10 years younger than he had that morning. The weight of 18 years of complicit silence finally lifted from his shoulders. Colleen Marsh was there too, her bruised face somehow radiant as she watched the father and daughter embrace. She had spent years believing that no one would ever stand up for people like her, that the world was simply divided into those who had power and those who suffered under it. Today, a stranger had shown her a different truth. The townspeople of Cedar Falls had gathered in small clusters along the sidewalk, watching as the man who had defied their sheriff walked free. Some wore expressions of shame, confronting the reality of their own silence in the face of so many years of abuse. Others looked hopeful for the first time in memory, daring to believe that things might actually change. A few old-timers wiped tears from weathered cheeks, remembering friends and neighbors who had suffered under Caldwell's reign, justice finally arriving too late for them, but not too late to matter. The town would never be the same after today. None of them would. "Daddy." Rosie's voice was muffled against his chest, but the words carried clearly in the evening air. "I was so scared when they took you away. I didn't understand why you didn't fight back. That man was so mean and you could have stopped him, but you just let him hit you, and I was so confused." Jack knelt down to meet his daughter's eyes, taking her small hands in his calloused ones. How did you explain moral complexity to a 7-year-old? How did you teach a child about the difference between ability and wisdom, between power and restraint? Remember what I told you? About why I became a soldier? Rosie nodded, tears still streaming down her cheeks. I wanted to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. But Rosie, there are different ways to protect people. Sometimes you have to fight. Sometimes fighting is the right thing to do. But sometimes, baby girl, sometimes the strongest thing you can do is show people that there's another way. That man hit me, and I didn't hit him back. And now everyone in this town knows that I made a choice. I chose to be the kind of person I want you to be proud of. They drove out of Cedar Falls as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost too beautiful for such an ordinary stretch of highway. Rosie fell asleep against Atlas in the back seat, exhausted by the emotional upheaval of the day, while Jack navigated the winding roads toward home. He thought about his wife, buried in the cemetery they had visited that morning, and wondered what she would think of how he had handled today. She had always been the one who believed he could be more than just a weapon. She had seen something in him worth saving, worth loving, worth building a family around. His phone buzzed with a message from Tom Harris, a simple text that read, "Thank you, from all of us." Jack smiled, the expression feeling unfamiliar on his face. He had spent so many years solving problems with violence that he had forgotten there were other solutions. He had been so focused on protecting his daughter from physical harm that he had nearly forgotten to show her what kind of man her father truly wanted to be. Today had been a reminder. Today had been a choice. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jack Miller felt like he had chosen correctly. Rosie stirred in the back seat as they pulled into their driveway, her sleepy voice cutting through the quiet darkness. "Daddy, I'm proud of you." 5 words. 5 small words from a 7-year-old girl who had seen her father stand down a bully without throwing a single punch. Jack's throat tightened as he turned to look at his daughter, this tiny person who contained his entire world within her fragile frame. He had killed men. He had survived things that would destroy most people. But nothing in his experience had ever prepared him for the overwhelming power of a child's simple declaration of pride. "I love you, Rosie girl." He lifted her from the car, feeling the familiar weight of her small body against his chest, a weight that had become the anchor of his entire existence. Atlas jumped down to follow them toward the house, where they had built a life together in the aftermath of loss. The porch light flickered on automatically as they approached, casting warm yellow light across the steps, where Rosie had taken her first unsteady walks, where Jack had sat countless nights watching the stars and wondering how to be a father worthy of his daughter's trust. Those questions felt less urgent now, not answered exactly, but somehow more manageable. The road ahead would not be easy. It never was. But Jack Miller had learned something important in a small-town diner in the middle of nowhere. He had learned that courage was not about being unafraid. It was not about overwhelming force or perfect victory. Courage was about making the right choice when every instinct screamed for the easy one. And today, with his daughter watching, Jack had finally found the strength to choose wisely. As he tucked Rosie into bed that night, Atlas curled at her feet as always, Jack allowed himself to believe that maybe his wife had been right all along. Maybe there was something in him worth saving. Maybe the best way to honor her memory was not through the violence he had been trained for, but through the love he was still learning to give.